Welcome to IB Unplugged, a Cognity podcast for IBDP educators that tackles your submitted challenges and questions by connecting you with experts and peers who share their ideas and stories from real classrooms. Whether you're a seasoned educator or new to the IB world, each biweekly episode and guest aims to equip you with practical tips and positive inspiration, helping you teach with more confidence, creativity, and joy. So whether you're walking your dog or commuting to school, hit play and join a community of educators ready to learn, laugh, and thrive in your IB journey. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of IB Unplugged. Today, we've got Dianne Blackburn, and we're going to be talking about inclusive learning for student well-being, universal design for learning, and approaches to learning in IB classrooms. Dianne has this rich background and started in creative industries and then got into education, and then has since been spending quite a bit of time leading workshops on universal design for learning, going into schools, spending time all across the world helping schools implement this idea. And I think what you can really gain from this episode coming up here is talking about ways that we can reach all learners without having to do like a massive change to our practice. Really, it's a bit of a mindset shift in terms of who's kind of in control of the classroom and how can I provide more options. So coming up. So some really exciting things coming up here with Dianne.
Yeah, I think that what you're really going to take out of this episode is that yes, UDL can feel quite daunting, but Dianne talks about it in such this infectious way of it's so positive for the students, and she sees such positive impacts with the students, and it doesn't take massive heavy lifting to get started. It's you're already doing some of these things. How can you be a bit more thoughtful? How can you tweak things a little bit to really have a greater classroom experience for not just some of the students, but all of the students? So with that, I'm excited about this episode, and let's bring on Dianne. Hi, Dianne. Welcome to IB Unplugged.
Hi there. Lovely to see you today, Courtney. Hi, John.
Hi, Dianne. So glad you're here.
So I want to get started here with our first warm-up question. And just to dive in a little bit about your experience, could you share why you've decided to pursue a career in education?
Oh, wow. So like many people, this is not my first career path. I've had 2-3 different career paths before. So I started actually in fashion and marketing. So I come from a creative background, and I had a lovely career for many years. And we moved abroad. We moved to Spain. So I moved into an international setting. And at that time, I suddenly had a desire to teach. I don't know where it came from. I had 2 very young children. But it was kind of, I can only describe it as a yearning to teach, a yearning to work with young people. And I was really exploring my creative side at that time because I was a house doctor. I was doing lots of interior design. I'd sort of moved on. So I trained up as a teacher and was very lucky to find myself in an international school pretty quickly, and found an IB school. And I think for many of us who have worked in the IB, I think when you find an IB school, it's all that teaching has ever meant to me, really. And that was the very beginning. I started as a visual arts teacher in an IB school teaching NYP 1 through 5, and was there for quite a few years and had the most amazing time working with young people from all kinds of backgrounds, developing their skills, developing their understanding of the world around them, and really connecting arts to the world and really understanding the importance of art in the world around us. So for me, it was just the most beautiful connection and a wonderful start to my learning journey in education.
What an excellent way to kind of get into it. I love the way you described that, a yearning for education, yearning for teaching young people. I think that's really beautiful. You know, my next question was going to be why international education, but it sounds like that's kind of what drew you right away. You're kind of in this new country and kids coming into it and just seeing a nice flow into that. Now, Dianne, I know that, you know, we're going to focus quite a bit on universal design for learning and ATLs and that sort of thing. And that's kind of a big part of what you're doing these days. So I wonder maybe just sort of the next intro question might be, what's the best part or the most rewarding part of your job these days?
I always describe myself as spinning several plates, like 12 plates at once.
John can't relate.
We all do.
Yeah, we all do that as educators, don't we? But You mentioned international education. I actually work quite a lot in the UK as well. And I work with UK state schools that are IB schools. And that's been a project I've been working on for the last 5 years. And those schools have taken IB programs in. So they're NYP, DP, CP, PYP schools. And they've also approached me to work on universal design for learning. And those schools, I think altogether there's about, I don't know, we must be upwards of 70 or 80. It's a huge group. And we've definitely grown the NYP community because we have a conference every year now. So we have a conference. Yeah. But we've grown inclusive practice in those schools, but also IB education. So it's not just those international schools that I work with, which I'm very privileged to work with through the IB and through my consultancy, but also I'm seeing really seeing great difference that an IB education and UDL can make to students who come from very diverse backgrounds, who are often students who who've had to come to the UK because they've been displaced in their own country. So, language learning becomes very important for them. Students from very difficult, challenging backgrounds. And we're just seeing how that is transforming their lives. So that's something I'm very, very passionate about. And I'm seeing that in other educational contexts as well, in international contexts. But yeah, that diversity of the schools that I work with, I think is just an absolute blessing. It's something that's, really gets me up in the morning, because you never know what kind of context you're going to work in, and just the difference that we can make is just incredible. So I feel very, very blessed.
Oh, I can feel your passion kind of oozing right away. And I'm excited for this now, because, we want to talk about inclusive learning for student well-being. We want to talk about universal design for learning, the approaches to learning, how we as educators can really incorporate young people into the classroom and make sure that everybody feels included and has the chance to learn really well. So I'm excited for this. What a wonderful preamble here.
So for our first segment, we're going to talk about universal design learning and really connecting that to student well-being. But the kind of first step to make sure everybody's on the same page is, could you describe UDL and why does it matter specifically in the IB context?
So I came across universal design for learning many years ago, before the IB was really using that as their preferred approach to inclusive practice. And when I discovered universal design for learning, I just thought, what a great fit, and what an easy fit for our educators. I mean, I have never met a teacher yet who says to me, do you know what, I've got lots of time. No one ever has enough time in teaching. We're always, it's the commodity that we're not rich in. But universal design for learning, when I first discovered it, I thought, this is going to actually make it easier to reach more students. It's going to allow me time to plan and to meet those students, but actually it's going to reduce my workload whilst also getting better results. And this is kind of what I always start my PD with, because if you have a group of teachers who are really time poor and are just doing their very, very best to reach those learners in their classroom, that, sometimes we just don't catch them, and we go home and think, I know that learner didn't engage with the learning today. I know I left them behind. That's not what we want to do. And for me, universal design for learning is an approach where we allow for student agency, and we allow students to be advocates for their own learning and to make choices in their learning, and also to go on a journey with our learners to learn more about them, what interests them, what excites them. And for me, that is part of the key to universal design for learning, because by doing that, we can reach more learners, because we can offer them choice, and we can offer the opportunity for them to advocate for the ways they'd like to learn, the ways they'd like to show what they know. And it's often a shift in a mindset in our teaching practice. But once we've made that shift, we can look at the differentiation that we might already offer and actually just be able to gear that more towards the learners in the classroom. And of course, universal design for learning allows us to reach more learners. So we think about teaching to the edges. There's children that we often find most difficult to reach, the ones who are perhaps in different contexts, we call them different things, but the students who will finish the task first, or we'll need to create a deeper task for them because they're going to finish much quicker than some students. But then also the students that have sometimes a diagnosed difference of a way of learning, but also those students that haven't even registered. So we try and work to those edges. But Universal Design for Learning allows for all learners and those in between to be able to really have agency and choice. Because, sometimes our learners, let's say we've got a student who's come in the morning who really doesn't, let's say they've had an argument at home with a sibling and they've had no sleep. And we would just provide for them what we always do. But they actually might really benefit from some scaffolds and supports, maybe some visuals to go with some text. And by offering that agency and choice, that student can go and take that choice and will just do much better. So this is how we start to think about some of those basics in Universal Design for Learning, how we offer a range in content, in process, in product and assessment, and just allow students to choose through that learning journey.
If I'm new to all of this and I'm going into and I'm learning from an educator who has really implemented UDL into their way of structuring their classes and their teaching, what are some of the more noticeable differences that you do see and that you do pick up on?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because in the UK context, we had an Ofsted visit in one of the schools, and in the report that Ofsted produced, they noted Universal Design for Learning, and they said what they noticed in that classroom was they could see from the classroom list that there was a diverse range of students there that normally would have had perhaps someone working with them or specific scaffolds and supports. But what they saw in that classroom was that students had agency and choice, so they were choosing different ways of working, maybe on different stations, but also that they could advocate for themselves. And there was someone else in the classroom there supporting. But hey, they couldn't see who they were supporting because they seemed to be allowing that person was supporting other students at the same time. So it's really thinking about, as an educator, if I'm offering differentiated practice, it's allowing me to think about the variability of the students in the classroom and offer those range of strategies to all students. So this is why it's not a big shift in what we're doing. It's the shift in approach. And it's thinking through that lens when we're doing our planning.
Okay, so if I get this correctly, it kind of sounds like we're very intentionally planning for differentiation within our classrooms. We're providing a fair amount of resources that will allow each student to kind of opt into where their challenge might be, giving them a bit more autonomy. And then the teacher is less like, I'm in control of the pacing and the how we're going through this course. And the teacher then becomes more allowing the student to run their own direction, and they're kind of in there as well, kind of guiding on the side. Is that a fair sort of summary of what I'm hearing?
It kind of is, but also it isn't, because the way that Universal Design works so beautifully in our IB classrooms is it just links intrinsically with inquiry-based learning. So in inquiry-based learning, we're listening to our learners and offering them choice in what interests them, what excites them. I use a great analogy, actually. I'll share this. It's quite funny. So when we think about recruiting interest with our students, I always liken it to myself and my husband. I've been married for a very long time, about 39 years, I think. Gosh.
Oh, wow. Congrats.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I met him when I was very young. I'm just going to say that. I was at school.
I only assumed.
But no, I mean, we have different interests and our attention spans are very different because of that. Now, he loves Formula One and he will watch Formula One for hours and days. And, I'll come into our living room and I can see these cars going around on the track, and I'm kind of like, what are you watching? And it's a rerun from, 1999. It was a particular, but he's watching it intently. And his interest is huge. Now, I will sit down and watch maybe the Monaco Grand Prix with him, and I will watch the first 5 minutes, and then I'll stray to my phone, and my interest isn't such that his is. So when we think about our classrooms, what we're wanting to think about is recruiting interest from our students. So it's really allowing them to say what interests and excites them. I was doing a school visit recently, and in that classroom, the students were all they were creating a game. They were doing it was an IT class, and they were creating a game. And it was, it seemed like it was a good idea, a good setup for the students. But I could see so many students were disinterested. And these were like 12, 13-year-old students, NYP 2-3. And I asked a bunch of the girls, are you interested? You don't seem to be particularly on task. And they said, well, it's a game. And I said, well, that's great. You're coding. Coding is really interesting, isn't it? You enjoy coding? Yeah, we do enjoy coding. And I said, well, why are you so, you seem really off ball with this. And they said, miss, it's a game and it's coding, but it's all about a pirate ship. So, it's I can code women's football. I can code Ariana Grande, I can code a game on fashion. Anything that interested them, we would have ended up with maybe 25 different games that looked different, but had the same core and basis. So it's really, that's how we can recruit interest. That's how we can offer agency. And for teachers, it's often quite scary because they're going to go off and look into different things. But isn't that enriching as a teacher that you find out about, different things that interest your students?
Yeah, you don't need to grade 25 pirate ship games.
But that was what, and even that, a pirate ship game for 12, 13-year-old girls, they were just never going to go there because it was the most uncool thing. Yeah. So this is what we need to think about. It's not about we need to be the expert. We are the facilitator of learning. We're facilitating our students' learning journey, and actually going on a learning journey with our students, for me, is one of the most exciting things that we can do in a classroom, that we can explore and expand our understanding of the world around us through their eyes, something that interests them. So my experience with UDL is when it's put into practice and place is teachers are just much more engaged in their students' interests and really understand, and actually, sort of take them by the hand and take them to explore an area, but then kind of learn from them. And that might be a scary thing for some teachers, but my goodness, it makes that working day much more interesting. It really does.
It sounds like a really positive way to educe or sort of pull out the interest from the young person, and as you say, give them the chance to be more engaged in their interests, kind of find the avenue in whatever course they're doing to say, oh, this is what I want to get from this, and here's how I can express more of my own interest in this area. I can see where that would build up a lot more passion, a lot more interest in the subject. And I imagine, it has the potential to do some things for that young person to make them feel better about being in school. One, feeling like they're recognized and they're a bit more included. And I'm just guessing there's some things that enhance their feelings of well-being when they're in that area as well. Is this something you've seen in the practice as well? And does it link to students' sense of well-being?
Yeah, absolutely, completely. And we can start, there's a couple of elements when we think about approaches to learning skills, which are incredibly important in this, but also speaking to our learners at the very beginning and setting the framework in the classroom. And I'm sure many of you out there do essential agreements, but do you provide them for your students, or do you actually recruit that from your students and get them to set the parameters and set the boundaries? Because that's the first part. Our students need to feel safe, and they need to feel like they have ownership of their learning. And when I talk about advocacy, it's really, I'm owning my learning journey, and I can advocate for myself in the way I want to learn. And again, that can be quite scary, but actually the benefit and the payoff from that is you have students who are really highly engaged, which means that attainment goes up. The schools I've worked with in the UK, they immediately saw attendance go up, which was just incredible. Behaviour improves. And I can give you another anecdotal reference to behaviour. There's one particular school that I work with that used to have like sort of the barriers, and everyone had to check in and check out. And, behaviour was an issue. And they really, really went very, very deeply into UDL. They're a school that has a real diverse population. So let's say 80% of their students have some kind of either diagnosed learning need, or are language learners, or come from a deprived background where they perhaps haven't had food, or they no money to clothe their child. Mm-hmm. So very, very challenging environments. The last time I went there, the barriers had all gone down, and I said to the head of school, what's happened? And he said, we just have kids who want to come to school. They want to come to school and they want to learn. And that's something that in the UK, in the Ofsted report I mentioned, that they really picked up on. So it's really engaging our students. And when a student is asked, how do you want to learn? What are you interested in? That's going to engage that learner so much more, isn't it? And our student well-being improves greatly. But what we also have to be very conscious of is being purposeful with teaching ATL skills. And those in the IB world will be really familiar with those. But the area I focus on mostly when I'm delivering any professional development is thinking about those effective skills, building resilience, allowing students to fail well, allowing them to learn how to make mistakes and that be okay. Because for many students, making a mistake, they will then shut down and they won't come back to the learning. It will take a long time for that teacher to encourage them, that this is okay and we can move forward. But if we equip our students with those skills in advance, I remember in my maths class, learning, I did love logarithms, which is some ancient piece of skill and technique I was talking to a maths teacher about the other day. But, for many students, they will find new things challenging. But if we can equip them in advance to overcome the challenge and fail well, because we don't get things right every time, that allows students to be much more resilient. And around well-being, I was mentioning the well-being project that I'm working on. That is one of the areas that we're really struggling with worldwide at the moment. That resilience and building capacity in our students to navigate the world around them within and beyond school. It fits into all of that so well, and our students just do better. They just do better.
What do you think are some of these biggest barriers? What you're saying, it's hitting all the things that most teachers do want to do. They want to be building resilience. They want to be incorporating the ATLs into their ways of educating. But when you're going into all of these schools, especially the IB schools, what barriers are you seeing most often to getting teachers to actually be in that place that they do want to be in?
Yeah, it's interesting because whenever I'm going anywhere, like any good educator going in, I do a survey. And I'll always ask the team, what is your barrier? What is your barrier to implementing UDL? Do you perceive it might be? And as I mentioned, it's always time. And I have a frank discussion with the teams when I'm there. If you are not differentiating in your classrooms, then you've got some work to do. If you are differentiating for your students, then it will be less, but you're just going to target it in a different way. So the perceived barrier is always time. And for me, that only exists if we're really not planning to reach a diverse range of learners in our classrooms. Mm-hmm. And then the second one is just knowing how to implement this, because what we're worried about, as all teachers are, we only get one chance with our students. And, we don't want to do something and then it not work. So it's understanding that approach and having confidence in that. So within schools, what I always recommend when I've been working with them is that they build a professional learning community and they share and they collaborate and they open their classroom doors to see what practice is working well and offer support and advice on practices that they're wanting to explore but are maybe feeling a little bit challenged about. So there's a makeup there, and it fits with IBL as well. I did some research on inquiry-based learning, and the challenges to implementing anything new is generally time and fear of change and it just not working.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said about kind of change management and supporting teachers in making these changes. But I think one of the things that is really hard to get teachers to work with is the time element. But you can't just tell them try harder. They're already trying as hard as they can. Like you both said, you're spinning so many different plates, and that if I take away time from one of these plates, it will fall and crack. What do you give as advice for these teachers that are like, I'm at max capacity, I've been running on 120% for 20 years.
Yeah.
I can't just stop. How do I do this? What what plate do I let drop, or what do I do differently to be able to make space for this?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because we are at capacity, often at capacity, but it is really working smarter, Courtney. I can't emphasize that enough. But I think we've just got to be kind to ourselves as well, and really appreciate that we are doing our very, very best, and we don't want to let our students down. But by making some small changes, and let's not say that I'm going to come into a school and work with a team and they're just going to the magic the next day change everything overnight. But certainly what I do is say, let's just change one thing. Let's change it in your planning. So the next lesson that you teach, that is the way you're going. And it's often just in how we're presenting content, or we're allowing students to informative assessments, have a little practice and a little try in showing different ways of what they know. And that works really, really well. And it's just building our own confidence. But as I say, if we've already got those differentiated practices in place for assessment, for the way that we allow them to engage with content, for the way that we go through that learning process, then it's just being more targeted. It's thinking, who are my learners? How am I going to reach those edges? And what about those ones who are in between? I always think of it, it's like a 180 degrees. And we aim at the middle and we try and catch the sides. But actually, if we think about just aiming for those sides and providing agency and choice, we catch many more students.
That's what I'm really hearing right now, actually, as I'm listening to you, Dan. I'm thinking, okay, there's a resource element here, and there's like, okay, I need my practical strategies and kind of how to lay this out. But what I'm hearing more of is kind of a mindset shift. It's a shift from the teacher saying like, this is the direction we're going. Here's my pacing. Here's my curriculum. We're going to get through it. And now I need to accommodate for everybody who might be on the outer edges of this, who can't follow the same pacing that I've got here. And I think often as educators, we think of that. There's either the like push in or pull out support, right? Of what sort of accommodations do I need to do for this student? How can I adjust their vocabulary or their, learning methods so that they can keep up with this class? But what I'm hearing right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it really sounds like it's a shift from, let me make sure you can keep up to this class. And instead it's, you pick your entry point, you pick your movement. And I, as the teacher, am now next to that. And I'm kind of guiding that pathway. And it's really that quite different. Yeah, it's kind of extreme differentiation is what I'm hearing. Is that okay? Is that kind of an accurate like mindset shift?
Yeah, no, you're spot on, but it comes with something else, which is in our planning. Who sits with us in our planning? So when I'm planning an NYP or in DP, who sits with us? We might sit with our subject team, might we? We might sit with a coordinator. We might have a head of year. Do we sit with our language specialists? Do we sit with our special education teachers? So if we can plan and work with them when we're reviewing our curriculum. And what I always do with the workshops that I do is I ask those teams to sit on tables around the room. So they're sitting with subject matter experts and they're working with them as the guide. Because, often we don't know how to reach those learners. And, we don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to miss out. And we also don't want pull. Pull is one of the most challenging things that we have in our schools. We really want our students to be together and be included, because there's such richness from having a diverse range of students in our classroom. Mm-hmm. But it's having those specialists working with us in planning, but also coming into classrooms and having them as as I mentioned, that school in the UK, they had one specialist who would normally just sit by the side of a student, but they were around the class. They were working with many different students and supporting many different students. And that allowed the student that they were sitting with, who is often that student who thinks, just let me breathe a little bit, just allow me to fail, just allow me to have some choice. That allows them some space, but also they've still got that support there. But they can then work more with their peers. I mean, I see so many classrooms where we have inclusion, and it's not really inclusion when we have a student sitting there working by the side of somebody on something completely different. They're not included in the classroom. There's another school. We've got some SEN schools now. They're called SEN in this context, but we have IB schools that are purely schools that are inclusive schools where students have very, very high learning needs, and they're IB schools, and they're doing Universal Design for Learning. And they have some of the best inquiry and collaboration that I've ever seen in classrooms. It's just incredible. But it's taking that step back. And as you say, John, it's a mind shift. It's not letting go of the learning, because we never do that, but it's facilitating our students each to do the best that they can, which sounds like a lot. But if you know that you've got students that aren't engaged, and, we can see the body language sometimes when they're not quite there, that changes so quickly. And for an educator, that's the best thing, isn't it? When you look around your classroom and it's just buzzing and everyone's on it and they're enjoying their learning, and they can come out at the end of the day and say, when parents and guardians say, what did you do today? They can be quite vocal about that, so it is it's a shift in approach. It's a shift in mindset, because I would imagine most of our educators already have what they need there. It's just that nuanced shift that they need to make.
Are you an IB educator wanting to improve your practice and needing just a bit more support getting there? Ever wanted to learn more about a specific aspect of the diploma program, or just ask a question to an educational theorist about a specific IB aspect? IB Unplugged is the place for you. Simply visit cognity.com/IB Unplugged to submit your question to us and have your question explored in more detail in an upcoming episode. And now, back to the show.
Something that stands out when you're talking, though, what I was thinking about is really this idea of I would say in the traditional sense, the only students that have differentiation are the ones that are kind of at the, when you were talking about that 180, like the most extreme ends. And I think that there are students that obviously need different types of assistance, but when you're the only differentiated student, one, there's a well-being aspect to you being the different one when everyone else is doing the same thing except you. But then two, there's also this, I wonder about the kids that are maybe on the border of like, they probably would benefit from having more support, but there's maybe a fear of, I don't want to be the different one either, where if you have a classroom where everybody is working on something differently, or it's tailored in some degree to what they're doing differently, it eliminates that separation between the kids that are either getting pulled out or on that edge and the ones that are really in the middle but not thriving in the middle either.
Yeah. I mean, just for example, if we're offering some scaffolds and supports for a student that might be towards that edge, so we might offer some vocabulary, a sheet with vocabulary on, some visuals, some guiding questions. Think who else might benefit from that, those scaffolds and supports in that classroom.
Right.
And it's, instead of just saying to that student, here's your learning, it's saying, right, guys, there's some visuals here if you want to take those. Here are some guiding questions if you just want to, to check in on some of the key points in what we're doing today. Here is some vocabulary. Do you need to take 2 or 3 of these? Whatever you need to take. And that's where that agency comes in as well, because, I'm perhaps a learner who isn't so strong in my language, but I'm not to a point where I've got any support there.
Right.
But actually just having that might be really helpful. But hang on, I actually really work better with visuals. So if you can give me a visual to work with as well, I'll take that. But I'm not on any scale. I don't have an IEP. I don't have anything at all. I'm just a learner who would benefit from some of those options. And that's where you really see classes really become very, very inclusive. And the more that happens, the more students can advocate for, actually, is it possible that I can take those STEM starters, those sentence starters today? I just could do with that because I'm tired. I'm 13 years old and I'm really tired. It's the end of the week. I'm feeling really stressed. What support is there for me? And you're right, that just means that those students who would normally be sitting perhaps to one side with someone supporting them, everyone is the same. And that's really what inclusion is all about. There's a great video that I often show, which shows a learner who has she has Down syndrome, and she just talks about, actually, just include me. allow me to advocate for myself and show and take the pace that I want to take in the classroom. And everyone in the classroom can benefit from her perspective as well. So it's taking that approach.
All right, so this is really fun actually, because what I'm hearing is good teaching and learning for students who might need additional support, or when you create a resource that's going to help learning for one individual, is potentially a resource that would help all individuals. So what I'm hearing is it's actually not so much about differentiation per se of like everybody has to have a different approach, but rather like it's a differentiation of your resources, recognizing that there are really good ways that people can access this knowledge, and then providing that for everyone. So you're not necessarily separating out people in the class, but you are separating out the ways in which they might acquire or learn the content, the knowledge, the skills. And then that's kind of the smorgasbord, right? It says, hey, pick up what you want and go from this. Then I can see where like the collaborative approach might be the best way, as you were alluding to earlier, that professional collaboration where, as I'm planning my lessons, yes, maybe I've got a head of department, or I've got a head of teaching and learning, or I've got an inclusion coordinator, or people in that team that are kind of with me in that. I can see where that would then remove the need for how do I accommodate for this student, and rather, how do I make sure I've got great learning resources so that students can choose which one they want to get into? Is that where we're at?
That's exactly where we're at. So having that support and reaching out, but also, reaching in. We want our inclusion team to reach into our classrooms and reach into the planning as well, to ensure that we are, teaching to the edges.
Yeah.
But it's that agency that students really quickly build up. And I can't emphasize this enough, because once they realize that they can have some choice, and that they can choose not just, what will help them, but actually what excites them, what interests them. Think about the pirate ship game, if we said to our students, you choose, we're all going to go on a learning journey about whatever that topic might be. The skills are the same. I'm still going to take those students through that skill development, but it's going to look different. It just engages our students so much more. It really does. And as an educator, it's just much more exciting.
Yeah.
A lot of the schools that I've worked with, they've noticed teacher retention has gone up. Now, my goodness, in some contexts, that is such a challenge. And, we've seen around the world post-COVID how we had a lot of challenges around there. But actually allowing teachers to have more agency in working with their learners, they're also happier as well. One of the slides I have at the beginning of my presentation is what's the benefit for students, but what's the benefit for you?
Right.
What is the benefit for you? And you go on a professional learning journey because you're understanding your students much more deeply. But as far as your planning goes, often you might be having to plan maybe 6 differentiated strategies that might work or might not work. And we're making an assumption with students where that ceiling will be. All of that goes. And we think about the variability of the learners, the ones in between, and think about those variables that perhaps we can't predict. I mean, we can predict language, for example, many of those we can predict. But those ones that we can't predict are often around well-being, around levels of anxiety, around what's happening in home life.
And these are the things that we can't necessarily measure, or we don't necessarily get a diagnosis on, right? They kind of come into the classroom. You're not fully aware of what else is playing in for the student, right?
Yeah, I was working with a school on their inclusion policy recently, and there was a whole area that we hadn't thought about that. And I said, so what about the students who come in, who suddenly something happens? What strategies do we put in place for them to support them? Something happens at home, there's a bereavement. These are all areas that sit within that well-being, which I mentioned the well-being project that I'm working on. That is well-being. Schools I go into, there are 2 main concerns right now. The first is well-being, and the second is AI.
Yeah. I mean, any educator that's going to any conference these days, those are the themes for sure.
Yeah.
I think we recognize that.
I'm doing a pre-con in Lyon on well-being, so if anyone wants to catch me there, I'm doing a pre-con on it.
Well, Diana, I love that you're bringing this stuff up here, and I especially like that you've mentioned autonomy and sort of student choice and building their own self-efficacy, I guess.
Yeah.
And we've alluded to approaches to learning earlier before, and yes, I totally buy into the affective skills that I think are going to develop here, including self-management and that sort of thing. Talk to me about ways in which the UDL can promote inclusive teaching, but through that lens of ATL. Like, how do our ATL skills of communication and collaboration and research skills and thinking skills and that sort of stuff, how are they enhanced through this as well? Because there's elements where I see where it's, yep, that's definitely going to push it. But then there's other things where I'm like, well, wait, how am I going to develop some social collaboration skills if each person's kind of like, oh, I'm building a game like this and I'm doing this thing like this? Talk to me about that. How do we see those two complementing each other?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's take thinking skills, creative and critical thinking. I often work with DP schools, and for DP schools, it's often all about, I need to get the content delivered. We need to get to this particular point, and that's fine and that's fair, and I get that. And we have these external assessments that generally aren't particularly inclusive for all learners. We know that we can say that we have learners that might need more time or might need scaffolds and supports. But during that approach, when we think about allowing our learners to develop skills outside that regular choice that they might make. So let's say in language and literature, they are always working towards producing an essay in a particular way to respond to an exam. Now, if we allow them to develop creative and critical thinking skills to work in different ways, to show what they know in different ways. So maybe we just take the essay off the table and say, actually, I want you to work in a different way. It might be that you'll create a video. It might be that you might do a presentation. You might do a storyboard. That our neuroplasticity expands by going into those different areas and being challenged and pushed. And then when we come back to having to do that rigorous exam that is a one-size-fits-all, we've got that well-being from seeing success in other areas, but also we can call on those creative and critical thinking skills where we've really developed our ideas in different ways, and it feeds back into that one-size-fits-all approach. And I've seen that there was a school I worked with in Turkey, and they had an external exam, and they wrote to me and said, the grades have shot up. And I said, so why have the grades shot up? And they said, well, we surveyed the students, and it was all around well-being, and it was around creative and critical thinking, being able to just think outside the box and being able to pull that in, because they'd had to work in different ways. They'd had to process in different ways. They'd shown assessment in different ways. And yes, they had to come back to that very narrow way of working in that one-size-fits-all test. But they just had more skill, and actually their confidence was so much better as well, because they'd experienced success in different ways. I don't know if that speaks to what you were looking for, John.
It's really interesting because I think that it's quite scary to feel like you're helping students prepare for an exam by not doing it like the exam. Like everybody talks about mock exams as being, that is a huge part of it. And so then you have to do mock exams for the mock exams, and you have to prepare like 10 degrees of always working in the same form to get to the point where when you go and take the exam, it feels the most comfortable. Like, I've done this before. But if I've done this before 100 times with no confidence, that's not going to make you feel any better.
No.
So no, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, and one that I think takes a bit of bravery, because it does feel a bit counterintuitive, but I do think that it makes a lot of sense.
And it makes a huge difference, and you don't need to do too much. But our students at the age of post-16 going into those DP exams, if we spend 2 years of drilling students in just one way, we are leaving behind so many who we could bring really to the table at a much, much higher level with much more confidence. I had a workshop a little while ago, and like body language, I love reading body language, and it was a diverse group of educators, and there was a guy at the back like leaning back in his chair like this. I thought, okay. And I went over to him and said,
we know that guy.
We've all had them, yeah.
DP science teacher. And I said, so thank you for attending the workshop. How are you finding the first session? He said, oh, it's not for me. I've got to drill my students with X, Y, and Z. And I said, well, if you could just take some time and just think about the context of your students and think about the learners in your classroom as we're going through the workshop. And just think about what choice you could start to bring in, even if it's just a little bit of choice. And it wasn't too long before he came back to me. I think it was like sort of the afternoon break that day. And he just said, I've got it. And I said, okay, tell me. I really want to hear this. Yeah. And he said, I give the students case studies and a question bank. And they sit and go through the questions, the case study, and then they respond to the questions and give it back and I mark it. I said, okay, how are you going to UDL that? He said, I think I'll get them to find a case study that interests them. He said, and that's going to really allow them to have agency and choice. He said, we'll go on a learning journey over what is a good case study and what isn't. So there's deeper learning there. He said, and then I thought, what do you think about me getting them to write the questions? I said, is that not going to be deeper learning for them? So that was his way of, let's create the questions ourselves. That's giving me agency. But also, let me find a case study that I'm interested in, rather than, I've got 3 case studies, make a choice. Actually, there's lots out there. Mm. So that was just in one day, that was his first exploration. But what a difference that would make to a cohort of students. Just that small shift.
I love what you're leaning into here, Dianne, because I'm listening to that going, yep, there's a real kind of concrete, practical example I know that I could implement right away. And so I'm wondering, what are some other routines or maybe activities that you know of that can help teachers embed, ATL skills into a UDL or, together? What are some of the routines or mindset shifts or things that we can do that really impact our classrooms in that way?
I think, I alluded to it earlier. It's teaching skill explicitly and not making an assumption that students have skills or that we're just, the skills are happening because we're all sitting in a group working together. Mm-hmm. Being very purposeful about teaching skills. And I think no matter what age the students are, at the moment in the IB programs, there's a requirement in NYP that we're the teacher of skills. But my goodness, often our DP students need those skills as well. So I think actually teaching skill explicitly and understanding your learners, and again allowing them to advocate for, I'm not so strong in this, or I feel I am strong in this one, or maybe setting some activities where you can just kind of watch your learners working together in a group and seeing who actually manages challenge well, or who's the noisy one, the loud one who communicates the most, and who's the one who finds that more challenging. Mm-hmm. But also sort of thinking about the type of activities that we do to allow different learners to come into their own strengths and find their own strengths. With ATLs, what I suggest to schools that have an ATL framework and they have IEPs is that they actually merge the two so that students have their own kind of ATL passport, that for those who have IEPs, it sits within that. And that allows all learners to be very cognizant of who am I as a learner, where are my strengths, where do I need to develop, and be able to advocate for that as well, and to have sight of that as I go through my learning journey. So that's something that I've seen schools really put into practice and is very transformative. But it takes the school to sort of say, right, okay, let's take that ATL framework. The one in the NYP it's 142 strands. We don't need that. We can just look at those broad categories, those broad titles, and think about how does that work for my learner and how does that work for me? Because the most empowering thing for a learner is not that we say, I'm now going to teach all of these skills to you because I think you need them. It's the learner being able to really advocate and say, I'm not so sure about working in a group. How do we work in a group? And actually giving them some strategy around taking different roles. Let's do a little bit of modelling first and then put them into that scenario so that, there isn't a place to hide in a group. Everyone has a role. And it's that kind of thing. It's just a nuance, but it might take 2 minutes. It might take 5. But actually just being very purposeful so a learner can say, I remember when I learned some strategies around collaboration. And the other piece that we often don't do in our schools is when skill has been taught specifically in, let's say, in INS or in history, that we then let our colleagues know, I've just taught those students to use a Gantt chart in NYP1. And they've learnt to use another type of time management and another type of time management. They've got 3 strategies. Can you reinforce that in language and literature as they're working towards their final goal? I mean, I speak to DP students all the time. And when I do speak to them, I generally ask them, how are you? And they normally go, it's that time management piece. If we were purposeful in teaching students time management at the age of 11, and we reinforce and practice that across with our colleagues, what would those students be like by the time they got into our DP classes? It would be a different kind of student that's able to manage their time, manage their own well-being, and be able to really find the best path through those very challenging 2 years that they have ahead of them.
There's a simple thing that I tried doing just a little bit. You were talking about that little nuance and simple things to add in. I tried this thing where I was putting just in my lesson plans, I would put, okay, what's my ATL focus? And what's my IB learner profile focus? What am I kind of doing with each of them? And I recognized like, oh, that might just sound like kind of a tick box exercise. But then I post it or I put it up for my students as well. And then it forces me to like, today I'm focusing on your collaborative skills. So I'm going to be looking for this. I want to see these particular things. So even just like throwing it out in front of the students was just a small change. It was still my lesson plan as it was, still the way to approach it, but just a matter of like, I'm going to call this out and here's 1 or 2 things I'm kind of looking for just to kind of pull their attention to it as well. And I can't necessarily say that that's been a massive success or anything like this, but rather it was just something, at least for me, to say like, I am being intentional, just as you said. Am I being intentional in like how I'm teaching this? And this is a skill I want to develop. So how am I getting to it?
I think the precursor to that is that we call that skill out right the way through that journey, but that we teach it first. And we're explicit with that teaching. You mentioned a smorgasbord before. Alison Yang has a smorgasbord that has literally hundreds of ATL skills. And they're all little strategies. You can click on them and download them and teach them. And I often think it's a gift I give schools. I'm passing someone else's hard work on. But often we just don't know how to teach a skill and we don't have time, and it's, we're time precious. But if we can just take a moment out of our teaching and say, right, here are some strategies around collaboration. You guys aren't maybe going to get on so well during this. Maybe, how do we manage conflict within groups? Just a little strategy that they have can go a long way, and then you can remind them and reinforce it. And then, John, as you say, if you've got that planned in your unit, but then if your colleagues in your year know that has been taught, that's where it really impacts, because they can say, remember in John's class how you learnt that collaboration skill? We're going to go into a group now. Let's just reinforce that and work on that together. It takes a bit of planning, but we should have that horizontal planning in our IB programs anyway. It's a requirement. So.
Ideally, that happens.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. And I think teaching, we've done some episodes really talking about skills-based learning. And I do think that one of the powers of being intentional about skills-based learning is also give students the like same common ground of like where you're all coming from to be able to do these skills together. And they have words behind it to describe it. It's not just like a feeling of being nice to collaborate. It's like, no, this is how you can actually do it. And I think that especially in the in all of the IB, there is a push to be very upfront about the ATLs. It should be something that isn't behind the scenes, but really something that students know what the ATLs are and can feel that there is a difference between a class that is working with this and not. And I'm curious about your take on that parallel with UDL of how much of this do you believe should be behind the scenes design versus an intentional conversation point with students? Like, should students even know what UDL is? And like, how do you frame that conversation?
It's a really great question, Courtney. Again, lots of great examples. And really, we think about students who are going from lesson to lesson. They're going from classroom to classroom. They've got some teachers who are teaching ATLs explicitly, teaching UDL through the lens of UDL. And anecdotally, if there is a class that isn't offering student agency and choice and isn't supporting skill, students will call that teacher out and say, where's my choice? And what skill am I working on right now? And I've seen that in classes. What I love that I've also seen is in UDL classrooms, let's say a choice board, where a teacher has constructed a choice board. And I'm a great advocate, by the way, of using AI to support this, because if you're building choice boards, you can really use AI to support that. But where they create a choice board and they leave a whole row blank, and the row is blank because that's the student's own choice. They've come in with some ideas for those students, but also here's some opportunities for you to bring your own in. And I can remember speaking to that teacher and saying, how often do they do this? And she said, every single time. So every single time I've got a choice board, it's come from their ideas, and then they always have an opportunity to add in even more ideas. So she said, I'm not actually doing all of the work anymore. It's the students that are bringing that in. But she said, I know that in some classes, they're not doing it to the same level or even doing UDL. And the students are shouting about it, and saying, I'm a passive learner in this classroom. I want to be involved. Where is my choice? And these are 11, 12-year-olds who are from, really, challenging schools. But they're on it. Why wouldn't you be if you're sort of sitting in a classroom and your learning is really passive and you're playing what I call ping pong, where it's question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. Am I recalling the information? Has it gone in? How much more exciting is it to actually sort of have some agency and choice in being able to work in different groups on things that, interests me in my group. And we can collaborate together because we know how to do that, because we've learned that skill, which is going to be useful when I leave school, because I'm going to have to work in a team probably,
All right, Dianne, I'm excited. I'm on board. I want to do some of this stuff, and I'm guessing some of our other teachers that are listening might as well. What's my first step? What's kind of one very actionable strategy as a classroom teacher? And I say, I want to apply some UDL principles. I recognize there's a whole framework here and there's a big thing that I could really latch onto. But if I just want to do one thing tomorrow, what's my first step?
Okay, I would say look at how you are differentiating, what you are differentiating, and create an opportunity for all students to take that choice. Don't just choose that for those students. Actually offer a range to students of, even if it's just through a learning engagement, how they're processing information. Maybe you're showing a video. If you're showing a video, give the video to the students so that they can actually stop it, start it, put subtitles on, but also offer them, some word cues, some screenshots, so that all students can actually engage with it and get the very best out of that video. It's that kind of thing. It's just thinking, who's my most difficult to reach student? What would I provide for them? Now let everyone have that.
That's actionable. I appreciate that.
It is. And it, like you said earlier, it's just a change in approach, isn't it? If we're not doing any differentiation, though, guaranteed you've got a bit of work to do. But if you are, then it's just shifting your approach and thinking about the variables that you have in your classroom and who might benefit, and just saying to them, guys, you can take that too if you'd like to.
I think this is great. I think this is a really important topic. I really appreciate it. And it's one that I think you've done such a great job of giving really concrete examples throughout this entire thing, where it doesn't feel like, oh, I got to throw away all of my teaching practice and start from scratch. It's no, you have these tools as a teacher to be able to make change. And a lot of you have thought about this in different ways for maybe only certain students, and it's just expanding that out. So Dianne, thank you so much for today. I really appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to echo that. Dianne, you're super enthusiastic, and it's transformed over to me as well. So I'm feeling it, and I'm excited to bring some of this stuff to my classroom. So thanks a bunch for taking the time to chat with us.
Oh, thank you guys so much. It's been lovely to meet you. Thank you.
IB Unplugged is a Cognity podcast hosted by John Patton and Courtney Marlene and produced by Catalina Gaffney. Be sure to subscribe or follow and share with your fellow IB educators. If you'd like to submit a topic, request, or question, please do so on cognity.com/IB Unplugged. Let's keep the conversation going and support each other in teaching with confidence, creativity, and joy. See you next time.